For the people who are here in the audience, can you hear my voice all right at this volume? You give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down? Thumbs up, I'm seeing thumbs up. People can hear me all right? All right. So for Finance Committee members and Carrie and I, if you're just talking a little bit louder than normal speaking voice, I think everyone who's here in the auditorium can hear us. And if you have your computer or if you have your Google Meet microphone on, then folks who are watching remotely will be able to see and hear us too. Joe, are you logged into the Google Meet?
Okay, welcome for joining us. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here tonight. This is an evening to get information and to ask questions about the upcoming non-recurring operational referendum. And we will start with a short video, and then we will move on to questions and answers. And we're going to need an extra minute to get everyone set up. We good to go?
We're all set?
Okay.
Carrie, can we restart that from the start, please?
On behalf of the Board of Education for the School District of Milton, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for taking time to watch this video. Some of you are sitting in the John C. Platts Auditorium and will be participating live in the question and answer session being hosted on Monday, October 5th. Some of you are attending this session virtually. Still others are watching this video at a time and location that best fits into your schedule. No matter how, when, and where you are watching, we appreciate your interest in the upcoming non-recurring operational referendum that is being proposed by the Board of Education. As the newly nominated treasurer for the board, I am keenly aware, as are all of our members, that each and every decision that we make is one of balance. On one side of the scale, we need to be responsible and respectful to the taxpayers of this community who help us fund education. On the other side of the scale, the board is responsible for continuing to provide quality programming that benefits our students. What happens in each and every classroom matters. What happens in the gymnasiums and on the sports fields matters. What happens in the auditorium, the music rooms, and in the arts matters. It matters to our students, our families, and ultimately to this community. These two things are not mutually exclusive of each other. When one side of the scale gets out of balance, it naturally affects the other side. We believe the proposed referendum will help us continue to maintain this necessary and important balance. It is our hope that this video and the questions and answers that follow will give you information that you will find useful. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Carrie Bradley, Director of Business Services at the MILTON School District. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about the operational referendums and why there might be a need for an operational referendum. Referendums are required if the school board determines that more resources are needed beyond the amount provided for by the revenue limit calculation. So you might ask, what are revenue limits? Revenue limits are sometimes referred to as spending caps or revenue caps, and they limit the amount of revenue that we can get from our two greatest sources, which are general aid from the state and our local tax levy. The legislature put revenue limits in place in the 90s. They're specific to each school district in the state and are based on prior year spending and the number of students in our community that we are responsible for educating. Our district has a long history of strong fiscal stewardship and relatively lower spending. Because of the way schools are funded in Wisconsin and the way school finance works, the low spending tradition in place in the 90s impacts us now and into the future.
As most of you know, in 2016, we proposed both a capital and operational referendum on what was coincidentally also a general election for the presidential race. The capital referendum, as you know, did not pass at that time, but the operational referendum did. And as it was proposed to be non-recurring with a 5-year life, if you will, that referendum expires at the end of the current fiscal year, in other words, June of 2021. The Finance Committee has worked for several months to look at what possible situations we would be in as this referendum comes to a close. We debated whether to propose another referendum and then whether that would have a dollar amount different than the current one or similar, and also we debated whether to make it a recurring or non-recurring ask for the voters. And ultimately what we landed on was to make it non-recurring. In other words, we're proposing 5 years for this referendum also, and it will be very, very similar to the one that's currently expiring. And we also found that the $2.5 million ask is identical to the one that's expiring and will also serve us additionally in the future.
I'd like to share some ways that the current operating referendum has been used over the past 5 years to effectively meet our students' needs. We've been able to retain an excellent staff. We've added staffing to allow us to provide effective class sizes and offer a wide range of opportunities for students. We've increased our support staff to address individual student needs. We've also increased our custodial staff to maintain our buildings and grounds, and addressed ongoing maintenance needs outside of the facilities referendum. This proactive approach saves us money in the long run. Another important point is because of the way that state financing works, only about $1 million of the $2.5 million in additional funding was directly supplied by our local MILTON taxpayers.
The Finance Committee spent several months over several meetings trying to find the balance that we currently enjoy between providing high-quality educational opportunities for our students against being fiscally responsible to all of our taxpayers. And we felt strongly that a continuation of our current referendum is the best way to do that.
We
have worked hard over the past year to identify several areas in which we can become more efficient. These items include making changes to our medical plan, bringing 4K classes back into school buildings to reduce our rental costs, implementing more efficient transportation practices, and updating our printing and copying contracts. Although the district has identified these efficiencies, with the current operating referendum expiring, we need to reduce the budget by $2.5 million, which would have a negative impact to our students. In order to maintain high-quality opportunities for our students, the Finance Committee felt that renewing our existing $2.5 million operational referendum makes the most sense, and it was the most responsible choice for the district.
People have wondered if this is the best time to ask the taxpayers to continue this investment in our students. Given the uncertainty around COVID-19 and the status of the national and state economies, we appreciate the concern that some have expressed that now might not be the best time to ask the taxpayers to continue this investment. At all times, meeting student needs efficiently and effectively should be at the forefront. We anticipate that our staffing and facility maintenance needs will continue over the next 5 years. In order to meet our students' needs, we must have adequate resources. With the expiration of the current operating referendum coming on June 30th of 2021, if the operating referendum is not renewed, we'll need to make $2.5 million in reductions for the coming year in order to maintain a balanced budget. I want to thank everyone who's attended or watched this video for your interest. For those watching at home, please contact us with any questions that you may have. We're now going to open up the meeting to answer any questions either from the audience or that have been emailed to us. Thank you very much. If there is anyone in the audience who has questions that they would like to ask, you can come up to the microphone directly in front of me on the ground floor and ask your questions. If there's not, we've prepared a few questions that we've heard from people over the last couple weeks, and we can answer those. And if people are watching from home, either watching live tonight or watching this down the road, we encourage you to reach out with any questions that you have and let us know how we can help provide information about the upcoming operating referendum vote. I'm going to call on our Director of Business Services, Carrie Bradley, to ask some of the questions that we have received from people over the past few weeks. And then members of the School Board Finance Committee or myself will answer those, and we'll continue in that fashion until we've exhausted the questions that we have.
Okay, in looking at the questions we have, there are several questions that revolve around the annual property tax liability and how the passage or failure of the referendum will impact the average homeowner with regard to their tax bills.
And I can give a little bit of an overview on that. I think Carrie is probably the best person to get into the specifics of that answer. But in general, this upcoming operating referendum that's coming to the voters in this election this fall is to maintain what was approved back in 2016. As I believe it was Joe that mentioned in the video, the 5-year non-recurring referendum that was approved back in 2016 will be expiring at the end of this current fiscal year, which ends on June 30th of 2021. The operating referendum that's being voted on now would start when the current operating referendum expires. So it wouldn't be an increase on what is currently in place. It would maintain, both for the school district, it would maintain the resources that we receive from the operating referendum, and for the taxpayers in general, it would maintain their current property tax rates if it were to pass. If the referendum does not pass, the two sides of that coin would be that the school district would need to reduce our expenditures by $2.5 million in order to have a balanced budget, which is important to us. And on the taxpayer side, there would be a reduction in their property tax. And I'll turn things over to Carrie to speak a little bit more to that piece of the puzzle.
One of the questions that often comes up is we have made the statement that we're going to levy $2.5 million. And in the end, the taxpayers will pay $1 million, for lack of a better way of saying it. And so these questions revolve around how state aid works. And as you saw, there's a couple concepts I just want to touch on, a couple of finance concepts. As you saw in the video, we talked about the revenue limit, and the revenue limit is our resources from general state aid and our local property tax levy. Okay. So the next step is we talk about that state aid or that state equalization aid payment. And I think a little understanding of how that folds in might help people that are struggling with the concepts. Costs, which are used to calculate state aids, are the district spending from those two sources, state aid and property tax, it's the general aid. And what happens is we have our revenue limit calculation, we state, and what we don't get in state aid becomes our local property tax levy. Then we live the year, we spend our money, including the tax levy dollars, and then in the next year, we're going to get reimbursed, if you will, for part of those expenditures with state dollars. And at the annual meeting during the budget hearing, I had mentioned that we get, for every dollar we spend, 60 cents comes from the state and 40 cents comes from local taxpayers. So it has to do with that relationship between that the revenue is the state aid and local property taxes. And then when we spend money, our shared costs are those same spending. So that dollar that we spend is made up of property tax and local effort. And I'm not sure if that was, and it's tied to what we had spent in the prior year. So when we get that aid payment, it will reduce our overall levy as we do our revenue limit calculation.
Is there anything that any of the finance committee members want to add to that question or thoughts that they want to share on that topic? I think that Carrie hit it pretty well. I know another part of that question that maybe wasn't specific there, but some people have asked, well, what dollar amount would be saved for a typical taxpayer if the referendum doesn't pass? And I'm going to refer people back to some information that was shared at the annual meeting last week, and I'm going to hold it on my screen to show you, but Carrie is holding up the cover of the financial supplement, and if you turn to page 4 of that, this is available on our website, or we can send it out to people if they're interested in it. There is a page that's specific to the mill rate, and on that document it shares that currently we're estimating for this current year that the cost of the current operating referendum is going to be about $1.19 on the mill rate, which means for an average $100,000 home or property value in our school district, the annual cost for the referendum, for the operating referendum, would be $119 per year, or just a shade under $10 per month. So in general, people can kind of estimate that if the referendum does not pass or is not renewed, that would be an estimate of the savings, and that's based on $100,000 of equalized value. And again, Carrie, if there's any more specifics that you want to add to that, I'll let you go ahead.
Sure. I just want to clarify, when we talk about what's going to happen to our taxpayers, is that what Rich is talking about is our equalized value, which is the property value that we are given by the Department of Revenue And when the individual tax bills come, they're going to be based on your assessed value. So we're talking at a high level with an overall district experience. So just to clarify that your bill may not be exactly what we're saying because your bills are based on assessed value, not equalized value.
And again, excuse me, again, anything that any of the Finance Committee members would like to share?
I think along the lines of mill rate, it's important to...
Can you unmute yourself, Mike?
Along the lines of mill rate, I think it's important to look at us in this general area. Our mill rate is very in line to what other communities are paying. So again, because we've been operating with this operational referendum, it isn't really adding to the taxes that people will pay, and it's also very much in line to this general area of Rock County and the surrounding communities.
That is an important point, and thanks for sharing that, Mike. Dave, did you have something to add?
Yeah, a couple things to interject, and those who've been watching us here the past several months have heard me talk about this, but I think it's worth repeating. You know, as I looked at this as a Finance Committee member and said, you know, is this something that we ought to explore? Some of the takeaways that I had that I'll repeat here again are, you know, as you look at our district's performance, one of the things that I have said in the past and will say again here tonight is that I think we're using taxpayers' money efficiently. And what I mean by that is this. ACT scores, as we look at districts relative to us, both throughout the state and here locally, our ATC scores are very strong relative to other districts. Our DPI report card from the state ranks us as an exceeding expectations school district, both of which I think are speak to the fact that we have good outputs for the amount of inputs that we have. Additionally, if we look at class size, our licensed staff to student ratio and total ratios are more students to staff than the state average. And so again, we're getting good outcomes with a lower level of staff relative to districts here and throughout the state. Mike touched upon this a moment ago, but as we look at mill rates, you know, if we're looking at the Badger Conference, if I have my stats right here, out of 8 districts, 5 have a higher mill rate than us and 2 have a lower. Again, I think speaks volumes to, are we efficiently handling our tax dollars? Another thing that I looked at, and this was more of a statewide thing, but I was curious about, you know, what are other districts doing in the state relative to referenda? And just in April of 2020, 48 districts throughout the state went to referendum and passed $1.7 billion of referendum expenses. And so as you look outside the fishbowl that is Milton, I think it speaks a lot to this is the way that districts are funded at this time, because again, we're using a system that dates to the early 1990s and trying to apply it to the expenses and realities of 2020. And then lastly, since the revenue limits went in place, just from some research on my own part, I found that about 400 districts, which is nearly every district in the state, has gone to referenda at least once during that period of time. And so the question of does having an operational referenda put us in a unique category, and the answer to that is no. That again, this is almost the new normal of how do we fund quality education through the state. And again, based on the outputs I talked about, I think we have demonstrated that we're good stewards of taxpayer dollars and are getting good outputs for our students, which are paramount. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Dave. Carrie, do you have another question?
Actually, I got a couple more. There's a real technical question here, but I think we probably should talk about it. The question is, what does recurring mean? And so I'll take that if that's all right with you guys. All right. So when you saw me presenting and we talked about operational referendums, I didn't go into detail, but there are 2 different types of operational referendums that can be done. One is recurring, which means that we take a vote once, and then that money becomes part of our base budget and follows us into the future. Another type of referendum is a non-recurring referendum, and that's what we're asking for. And those have a time limit. So we're asking for additional levy authority or additional resources for a certain period of time. So in our case, when we're renewing, we're asking to maintain that for another 5 years, as opposed to asking for 2.5 and then building it into our base into the future forevermore. So that's what recurring means, and consequently non-recurring. Did you have anything you want to add on that one?
If I could just add one thing on that. We have, this is Rich again, we have heard a question raised about 5 years ago it was passed and it was non-recurring, and now we're bringing it to the voters again. And even though we're bringing it back again to continue that, it still is considered to be non-recurring because we're giving the voters the option and giving the voters the opportunity to balance that investment in our students and staff and programs versus the potential savings in their taxes. So, and if this were to pass, then 5 years from now, the voters would have another opportunity to decide how high a priority that is. Another question, Carrie?
Yes, I have actually quite some time ago been asked this question, and the question has come back again, and I have done some research. And Rich touched on it in the video. As people ask the question, what did you do with that $2.5 million? And I did some research again and looked and reviewed different things, and just wanted to share, at least from my perspective, what I have learned about how the money was spent. So as Rich had mentioned, the largest portion of our budget is staff. And if we look at our history, we have added staff, and Rich touched on that in the video. And that additional levy authority through that referendum helped make that possible. The other piece that I spent quite a bit more time on is the building maintenance improvements and the living document. Okay. That's another big area where we spend money. So we need to educate children, and it takes people to educate children. We need a place to do that, so we have our school buildings. And it costs, obviously, you know, from the most recent building referendum, it costs money to build buildings, do maintenance, and it also continues to cost money to have utilities and keep a safe and healthful learning environment. The other piece in the budget where we spend quite a bit of money is on transportation. And then finally, and this is kind of new to me, is technology. I've been doing this for a while now, and technology was not a significant portion of costs. And now it's kind of creeping up into the top 4 or 5 areas where we spend money. And so with regard to the facilities, when I look back over history, I have seen and talked to people, and with our living document, we had planned maintenance projects of about $450,000 a year. If something came up, a project would be done using fund balance, is my understanding, or what other budget resources we had at the time. When the referendum passed, we doubled and sometimes tripled our investment in taking care of our facilities. So I think it's fair to say that some of that referendum money has gone to maintenance and improvement of our facilities. And not to go on too long, because there's a Packer game that's going to be on soon, but I just don't know if people have some idea of how much it costs to maintain. We have over 700,000 square feet of facilities, between 700,000 and 800,000 square feet. When I looked through our historical documents, a roof is between $200,000 and around $250,000, and sometimes that's just a section of a roof, just depending upon how big the building is. A blacktop and asphalt expenditures and parking lots range from $150,000 to $600,000. Boilers, between $100,000 and $150,000 for a boiler. There's been a lot of renovation done in the bathrooms as well, sometimes as high as $300,000. So it's typical every year to do roofs, blacktop, and mechanicals, your HVAC systems. Every year you need to spend money to keep things in order. And even though we're taking care of some of that maintenance needs with the 59.9 building referendum, in addition to adding spaces. Just the awareness of the size of the square footage we're caring for, and then the cost of that. So I think it's quite reasonable to say that some of the referendum money was spent on those maintenance, maintaining our facilities so we can have a safe and healthful learning environment. And then also on technology and resources so that our students have what they need to participate in education and to learn what they need to.
That if I could share one thing, that question about how has that investment in the operating referendum been used over the past 5 years leads itself very well to another question that we've heard frequently, and that's what would be the impact on the school district if it doesn't pass? So Carrie just shared that a large majority, nearly 80% of our operating costs are spent on staffing, and then highlighted some other areas that are significant costs, the building maintenance, technology, and transportation. And just like the answer to the last question, that those are some of the things that money has been used for over the past 5 years, that also is the answer to the question about what would be the impact on the school district if we no longer have that $2.5 million. As I shared earlier, having a balanced budget is important to us. So if we had $2.5 million less in revenue, we would need to reduce our expenses by that same amount in order to keep a balanced budget. We don't know right now exactly what that $2.5 million in reductions would be. Some people have asked what extracurricular activities would need to no longer be in place or would be cut. How large would class sizes be? Those types of questions. And we would need to go through a process to determine that. I think it's important for us to have input from our staff and input from our families and community members. So if the referendum doesn't pass in November, we would put together some listening sessions and a committee to look at potential places where we could reduce. $2.5 million is about 6% of our operating budget. So if you think in general, we would need to reduce about 6% of our expenses. That doesn't mean that we would cut 6% in every department or at every school. We would have to prioritize where we think we could do that and have the least impact on our students. But we do know that the $2.5 million per year that the taxpayers invested in our students 5 years ago has had a significant impact on our students and would continue to have a significant impact on our students if it is passed again this year. Board members, members of the Finance Committee, anything else that any of you want to share to that topic?
Rich, I think that another important point is that for this next coming year, we have been given indication of what the state aid is going to be, but beyond that, we don't know. And we're living in really uncertain times now. Our state, like all states, has been affected by COVID. The taxes that are being brought into the state are being greatly affected by COVID. And so if the referendum didn't pass and state aid was lowered, that first year, it could be a double whammy as far as cuts go. And I think the timing of this, while some people have said the timing isn't good, I think the timing is actually very good based on that. And I would hate to see us have to cut 2.5 and in addition cut more because the state funding is going to could possibly be lowered.
I think to interject with that, two things that struck me was, going back to, where would cuts occur, and one of them does impact students directly in the student to staff ratio. And as I noted earlier, relative to our peers and the state average, we already have a slightly higher than average student to staff ratio. So if we look to make cuts in that area, We are going to go to above average, which is undesirable in this category, to further above average. And then the other item that we talked about was building maintenance and things like that were supported by the current operational referendum. I think most people will agree deferring maintenance isn't truly saving money. Deferring maintenance is just putting off expense to some future tax roll. And so the idea of let's defer maintenance as opposed to doing maintenance when it ought to occur doesn't really present a true saving opportunity. So in light of those two things, again, we're student to staff ratio, we're already above the state average. This referendum helps us maintain where we're at. And again, other cuts, again, if we're deferring maintenance as part of cutting, that's not truly a saving opportunity, but just simply passing the buck to a future board and a future administration to figure out ways to take deferred maintenance and get it current again. So those two thoughts carried a lot of weight with me as we looked at this, and again, as we developed, how did we get to this recommendation? Both of those were in the back of my mind as we struggled with this decision.
For our community members to make sure that they are alert to. I think on that topic of that Mike brought up a little bit about the timing of bringing this to the voters. And the one thing that we don't have any control over is the fact that the current operating referendum will be expiring at the end of this fiscal year. So if we waited another year to bring this to the voters, we would have to go through that $2.5 million in budget reductions, eliminating some programs and cutting staff. And then hopefully, if we did bring it back to the voters and they approved it, we would be able to add those things back, but it would be after having had to make those reductions for at least 1 year. Carrie, other questions that you have?
I believe that we've covered the variety of questions that were asked.
Why are we calling it a non-recurring referendum if it's coming up every 5 years?
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
I'm not sure if everyone could hear that. I'll repeat the question that was emailed in was, why is it being called a non-recurring referendum if it's being brought back after 5 years? And I spoke a little bit to that earlier, but I'll speak a little bit more to that topic. It's non-recurring because it's not permanent. As the Finance Committee had discussions about this, one of the things they talked about was whether to bring back a recurring or a non-recurring referendum. And the group and the board did decide to bring to the taxpayers the non-recurring referendum, in part because it gives a future school board and future taxpayers the opportunity to make changes if they feel that it's best at that time. So it really allows that choice to be made at the time that the current operating referendum is being set to expire. We're in that situation right now with the current operating referendum expiring at the end of this fiscal year. So the choice for our taxpayers now is whether we continue what we put in place for another 5 years and then make another decision at that point, or we decide that we aren't going to provide that resource to the school district, and then the school district will go through the reduction process to cut that funding from our expenses. So in general, the recurring is permanent, it's in place once the voters approve it. Non-recurring has a set time limit. We've determined that 5 years provides stability for our school district, and but it would come back to the taxpayers again after those 5 years.
Along those lines, too, I think it's important to know that a non-recurring referendum doesn't have to be 5 years. There are districts who pass 20-year non-recurring referendums. I think a 5-year increment is a nice increment. It's not too far in the future. It gives the board time to reassess and take stock of what the needs are after the 5 years. And so I think a 5-year increment is actually a good chunk of time.
One of the things that we want to do as we're doing our financial planning as a school district is try to avoid a lot of the roller coaster effect with the tax levy, where it's increased and then it runs out and is gone, and then it increases again, and there's a lot of large increases and large decreases. Keeping that stability, I think, is important for the taxpayers so that they can plan. It's also important for the school district so that we know what resources we're going to have from year to year. One of the things that I spoke to earlier that kind of reinforces that is that the estimated mill rate for this coming year for our school district, the total mill rate that includes our capital referendum that was passed a year ago and our current operating referendum that's in place, that mill rate is $9.18, which is almost exactly the same as it was 5 years ago after this current operating referendum was passed. So the mill rate went down over a few years in 2017 and 2018. It decreased. With last year's capital referendum, it went up to $9.26, and now we're estimating for this year that it's going to be down to $9.18. And keeping the current operating referendum in place wouldn't make a significant increase to that. As we mentioned earlier, it would maintain that, and that stability is good both for our planning purposes as a school district and to provide planning and stability for our taxpayers. Carrie, Bradley, did you have anything else that you wanted to share on that topic?
Actually, you mentioned the roller coaster effect. And when we look at the data, basically our levy was going down. And part of the reason it was going down was because our debt service was all paid off. And then last fall, when we took on new debt, we did have that increase. So when you compare those 2 years, that's an example of the roller coaster effect to the levy. Our debt fell off. And then when we passed new debt, it felt like a pretty good sized jump because our levy had gone down because our debt was retiring. So it's just an example of what you're talking about. With this, the renewal will prevent the roller coaster from happening in the future.
Finance committee members, anything else that you want to share or any other thoughts?
One last thought that I had, Rich, was again, leading up to this, trying to do a little bit of outside of Milton research, and I came across a paper by an organization called the Badger Project. They had published a paper in June of this year, and Benson Garner, who was the former spokesperson for the Department of Public Instruction, I thought had an interesting quote, and it basically says this: there's a danger of evolving into a state where there are haves and have-nots, where the districts that are able to pass referenda, they feel they can pay the taxes, they are the ones who will have stronger schools, and the ones who feel they can't are the ones who don't. And that quote stuck with me, because I think everybody listening to this and within the district takes a lot of pride in the fact that I think we all feel we have stronger schools here, and reflecting on that comment and looking at where do we want to go, not only today but into the future. If we're committed to having stronger schools, this is one of the tools in which we're able to achieve that. And like I said, that carried a lot of weight with me as we kind of entered into this discussion and, came up with what do we think is fair to our students and fair to our taxpayers. And I think this finds a good balance between both.
Thank you, Dave. Mike or Joe, anything else that either of you want to share?
I guess my final thought is I've been involved in education in this district for over 30 years as a teacher and now on the board. And Milton has always had a fantastic reputation for their school district. No matter who I talk to, whether it's back home where I grew up in Elkhorn or in surrounding communities, when they hear that I worked for Milton, the school district, the first things out of their mouth were what a great school district it was. That's why after retiring, I chose to run for the board so that I could continue to support this wonderful school district. And I would hate to see that be whittled away at. I think that we have such a great thing going, and I just think this allows us to continue to build the school district that we have and make it even stronger than it already is. So that's my final thought.
I guess this is Joe. I guess I have one piece I haven't shared a whole lot tonight because I agree with what most of you folks have shared. Oh, I'm sorry.
So I'll start over. So this is Joe. I guess the thought I'd share that I think it's important for the audience to know is that the Finance Committee's work probably even predated two of my co-Finance Committee members. And I want folks to know that because we had relatively new people in the administrative and business office, we really kind of started from the ground up and took a very hard look at should we have another operational referendum, and then what would that look like? Both the dollar amount that would be appropriate and the whole discussion about recurring or non-recurring. So I want folks to know that we didn't automatically sort of just check the box that we would continue what we're doing. However, the reasons for doing the referendum that's currently expiring still exist. And when we examined all of those, we found that the dollar amount was sufficient and adequate to keep doing what we're doing. So that side of the question was the first part that we answered. And then we did spend a great deal of time debating recurring versus non-recurring. And while it does seem recurring to folks, if we've just had a 5-year one, and if we're successful again on a 5-year referendum, that creates a 10-year window. And I know that seems like that's every year for folks, but we truly wanted, and we've used the word balance an awful lot tonight in our video, and that's very, very important. The 5-year window, if you will, became a balance point, and I think Mike alluded to the fact of it's a compromise between a little degree of certainty in the next few years against the uncertainty beyond year 4, 5, or 6. And we want to give the future school board and the future community a chance to reevaluate in 5 years what our needs are. So while this does seem recurring to folks, it truly is not. And Mike alluded to, there are districts that have recurring referenda that, of course, are in perpetuity. But as their needs change, they would come back to the taxpayers and add a non-recurring referendum to a recurring one. We didn't really like the way that played out for the folks and chose not to do that. So for the certainty that we can establish within 5 years, landed on $2.5 million for 5 years and reevaluate at that point.
This is Rich, and I want to thank our Finance Committee members and our Director of Business Services, Carrie Bradley, for their work in studying this issue, our additional school board members who have been very involved in the discussion and research into this issue. And I want to close with just one more thought, too. It's been just a little bit over a year that I've been with the School District of Milton, and there's a couple things that I've been extremely impressed with during my time here. One has been the high quality of our staff and what a talented, dedicated, again, hardworking staff we have across our school district, not just our teachers, but also our aides, our administrators, our school nutrition staff, our building and grounds staff. Everyone does an outstanding job in working hard to ensure a high quality education for the students of Milton. And we have the data to back up the fact that we've been a very high achieving school district over the years. And we should be proud of that. Our students, our families, and our staff should all be proud of the high achievement that our students have, both academically and through our different extracurricular activities. The other thing that I've been impressed with is how we've been able to do that at a relatively fair cost to our taxpayers. As was mentioned earlier, if you look at other districts around our area, our mill rate compares very favorably to other districts in our area, and we value the importance of both of those roles. I think it's extremely important that we are strong fiscal stewards and that we are efficient with our use of taxpayer investments. I also think it's extremely important that we are effective in our education of our students and that we're doing everything that we can to continue to provide a high quality education and strong opportunities for every student across our school district. So we've been able to do that over the years. We'll continue to be able to do that. And we hope that we've provided information so that people can make an informed